Chapter 3 on communication in the self introduces us to the concept of self-disclosure. As we've learned in earlier chapters, we learn about who we are based on communication, and one of the ways we learn about ourselves and others is through the process of self-disclosure. In this presentation, we will start by defining the concept of self-disclosure. We'll look at the possible benefits of self-disclosure as well as the risks that go along with self-disclosure. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at some guidelines for self-disclosure and when we should share personal information within the context of a relationship. Let's begin by defining self-disclosure. Based on the interplay text, self-disclosure is defined as information about the self that is purposefully communicated to another person. As we will see, though, self-disclosure goes a little bit deeper as far as how we define it and what it is and what it is not. So we don't get confused with the fact that any time we share information about ourselves is an instance of self-disclosure. To expand on our definition, we need to look at 4 additional distinguishing factors. These are honesty, depth of information, availability of information, and the context of sharing. First and foremost, the information that we share with another person must be true, at least to the best of our knowledge, for us to classify this information as self-disclosure. Second, we need to consider the depth of information. One of the models of self-disclosure in the interplay text, the social penetration model, classifies information into 4 different categories: cliches, facts, opinions, and feelings. Usually, self-disclosure lives in the realm of sharing opinions and sharing feelings, because this information is information that other people normally would not have access to unless we provided the information for them. So that leads us to number 3, the availability of information. Sharing information in self-disclosure must be information that another person cannot easily have access to without us providing it. Cliches and facts often are information that others can get about us, whether that's by talking to someone else who knows us fairly well, or even just perusing our social media profiles. Finally, we need to consider the context of sharing, where and when the communication happens, and also the relationship in which the communication happens. For instance, sharing with your best friend what you did at a party the night before or the weekend before and how much alcohol you consumed probably would not be considered self-disclosure, because that type of information is commonly shared within a relationship. However, sharing that information with your parents or maybe with your instructor would change the context of sharing and would more likely make that information count as an instance of self-disclosure. Now that we have a more clear understanding of self-disclosure in our relationships, we'll start by looking at some of the benefits and risks that go along with self-disclosure. Let's look at benefits first. The first of these benefits is catharsis. Catharsis is defined in Shakespearean terms as an emotional release, and sometimes we share information and or self-disclose information in our relationships simply to get that information off our chest. Maybe there's something we really feel like we need to share with someone just to kind of have that release of that information. So we share the information within a relationship in order to experience that emotional release. Secondly, we share information about ourselves for the purpose of self-clarification. When we're talking about ideas or beliefs, sometimes it requires us to share more personal information in order to more fully explain why we ascribe to that particular idea or opinion, or how we form that particular belief. We also may disclose information about ourselves for the purpose of self-validation, to find out, does someone else think the same way as us or feel the same way as us? We may share a piece of personal information about an opinion or an idea or a belief just to see if someone else has held that same opinion or idea or belief. As we've learned, finding out that others are like ourselves is very validating to our own self-concept. The next component of self-disclosure as far as benefits is reciprocity. we kind of have a sense of equality in our relationships when it comes to self-disclosure. When someone shares a piece of personal information about themselves with us, we almost have this sense that we should share a piece of personal information about ourselves with them in order to maintain that balance of disclosure in our relationship. So sometimes we may choose to disclose in order to reciprocate disclosure of another person. Sometimes we may choose to disclose information in the hopes that the other person will reciprocate and share a piece of personal information with us. The next benefit of self-disclosure is impression formation. We've talked about how we have an idea of who we are, and we talked about the concept of identity management, and we may selectively disclose information about ourselves with another person to create a particular impression of ourselves or our identity that we want to portray within that situation or relationship. Our final two benefits of self-disclosure are relationship maintenance and enhancement and moral obligation. With relationship maintenance and enhancement, we use self-disclosure as a way to maintain the relationships that we have and to enhance those relationships. When we think about it, disclosure is very high at the beginning of relationships and tends to naturally decrease as that relationship progresses. One of the reasons for this is because a new relationship is exciting and we're sometimes eager to share personal information about ourselves in order to learn more about the other person. But the other reason for this is that as another individual gets to know us fairly well, then the amount of communication that actually qualifies or is defined as self-disclosure naturally decreases, simply because they know so much information about us already. However, it is necessary for there to be regular instances of disclosure within our relationships, even long-term relationships, in order to keep those relationships interesting and exciting. The final benefit of self-disclosure is moral obligation. Sometimes we share information about ourselves with another person simply because it's the right thing to do. One example of this may be if you have formed a friendship with someone and you feel that friendship is going to continue into the future, but there's something about your past that you think that person is entitled to know. Perhaps you were incarcerated for some reason, or maybe you had a drug addiction problem earlier in your life. Sometimes we share that information with another person simply because it's the right thing to do, that this other person deserves to know that information about us. All this information about us and our past because we've established what we feel to be a long-term relationship with that person, so sometimes we may share out of moral obligation. So now that we've looked at the benefits of self-disclosure in our relationships, we also need to take a look at the other side, the side that maybe we're more familiar with, and that is the risks of self-disclosure. Anytime we're sharing personal information about ourselves with another person, there's a certain number of calculated risks that come along with that. The first risk is pretty obvious: rejection. What if I share this information with another person and it turns them off, or it changes their idea of who I am, or they don't accept me based on this information? We always run that risk when sharing personal information, opinions, ideals, or values with another person. The second risk is creating a negative impression. As we've talked about with benefits, we may choose to disclose in order to create a positive impression, but sometimes our disclosures may be contrary to what the other person thought about us, or may be contrary to their own opinions and ideals, and that may create a negative impression of us based on that disclosure. The next risk of self-disclosure is the possibility that sharing information about ourselves with another may decrease the relational satisfaction. Sometimes we receive information or learn information about another person that maybe turns us off in a certain way, makes us think about how that person is really not the type of person that we thought they were, or I never would have thought that this person would have that particular opinion or idea or value. And we begin to see less satisfaction in that type of relationship that we formed with that person. A fourth risk of self-disclosure is loss of influence in the relationship. This is easy for us to visualize when we think in terms of workplace relationships, especially superior-subordinate relationships. As a boss, what type of information do you disclose to your subordinates, and how might that information affect the balance of power in the relationship? This also goes along with our friendships. We know that in our friendships, we perceive that there's some sense of balance of power in our friendships, and sharing personal information can create an imbalance of power within the relationship because perhaps the other person has more influence over us because they have that piece of information. Our final risks of self-disclosure are loss of control and hurting the other person. With loss of control, this deals with the control of the information that we've provided for the other person. In self-disclosing, we've given the other person bits of information about ourselves, and there's really no guarantee what the other person will do with that information. Can we trust that they will keep the information confidential within the relationship? Or do we perceive that there's a possibility that the person could share that information with someone that we would prefer they not share it with? This opens up the idea of losing control of the information, and it is a calculated risk that goes along with our self-disclosures. Finally, hurting the other person. When someone asks for your honest opinion, do you give them your honest opinion? Because sometimes your honest opinion may not be what the other person wants to hear. So we have to calculate that risk in self-disclosure. Do I give my honest input here, even if it hurts the other person? And that is another risk that comes along with self-disclosure. So we've defined self-disclosure. We've taken a look at benefits of self-disclosure and how self-disclosure really can be a positive influence in our relationships. We've also taken a look at risks of self-disclosure and the idea that anytime we share personal information about ourselves within a relationship, there's a certain number of risks that come along with it. So how do we know when we should and when we shouldn't disclose in our relationships? And how do we make that decision as far as disclosure? There's no magic formula, and a lot of times it's just a gut instinct as to whether we share that information with another person. But our textbook does provide us with some things to think about when disclosing information and when we should or should not disclose information within our relationships. First and foremost, thinking about the relationship itself. Is the other person important to you? Obviously, family relationships, close relationships, and romantic relationships, the answer to that question will probably be yes. So we need to consider what is the value of the relationship that we have with the other person, and is the value of that relationship worth the risks that may come along with disclosure? We also need to consider, is the risk reasonable? We have information that's high information, and we have information that we consider to be low risk information. How we define that will differ from person to person, but consider the risk of self-disclosure. Is it a reasonable risk? For example, how do you share with your boss your perceptions of their flaws in managing their employees? Because if you do, you may create a negative impression, and that may have an effect on whether you continue to be employed in that particular business or organization. So think about the risk of disclosing the information. Third, is the disclosure appropriate or inappropriate? This deals with the relationship itself. Is this the type of information that you would normally share in this type of relationship? We also need to consider the context of the sharing. Is it very early in the relationship, and is this the type of information that we share early in relationships? Or is it the type of information that usually we learn about someone that we have known for a few weeks or a few months or maybe even 5 years down the road? So is it appropriate in the context of the current relationship that you have? Number 4 is the factor of reciprocation. In the relationship that we have, when we disclose information, it is typically reciprocated by the other person. When we share a piece of personal information with the other person, do they reciprocate that by sharing a piece of personal information about themselves with us? In situations where we're disclosing information and the other person is not disclosing information, we really need to question that relationship and the motives of the other person in the relationship. If they're always trying to get personal information from us without sharing any personal information about themselves, then we need to question, would we want to continue the disclosure in that relationship? Finally, will the effect of the disclosure be constructive? We have to think about how the disclosure will affect the other person, how it may influence the other person and influence the relationship that we have with them. If we perceive that the effect will be positive and productive, then that will give us a better sense of whether we should disclose the information. If we perceive that the disclosure may somehow be destructive to the relationship, then we may need to take some time to evaluate and truly consider if we want to disclose that information, at least at that point in the relationship. This concludes our presentation on self-disclosure, looking at the definition of self-disclosure, the benefits and risks associated with self-disclosure, and some guidelines for disclosing information within our relationships.